Hey everybody, it's Joe, the 3D printing professor, and today I am starting what is going to be a series of video talking about 3D printing's failures. 3D printing's been around for a little while, and during that time there have been some ideas that people have explored, tried out, and then discovered that it didn't quite live up to the hope that we had for it. And in this series, I want to find out if there's anything that we can learn from the branches of the 3D printing tree that should probably be pruned. And if you enjoy this sort of conversation about 3D printing, I invite you to join me on Discord, where we have a great community of people who are doing great things with 3D printing and helping others do great things as well. I hope to see you there. Today we are talking about color mixing 3D printing, partially because I have here, donated to me by one of my very supportive watchers, a M3D Crane 3D printer. This 3D printer launched on Kickstarter, and it was a color mixing 3D printer that would potentially fulfill the promise of this great idea in 3D printing. Of course, color mixing is an idea that it seems like a lot of people have had even before we had a good solid prototype to try the idea out with. It's such a simple idea. The basic idea is that you have a nozzle that is a little bit bigger than normal and can take 4 filaments going into it. And by carefully choosing the filaments that you go into it, say using cyan, magenta, yellow, and white, you could, just by adding more or less of each of the colors, create any color of filament coming out of the end of that nozzle. So if you wanted yellow, you would just stop all the other colors and only push out yellow. But if you wanted green, well then push out the yellow and the cyan at the same time, and they would come out together in the nozzle mixed to a green. Of course, if you wanted it lighter or darker, add more or less white to it. And if you want black, no white, just all of the cyan, magenta, and yellow at the same time should theoretically mix to black. Now, if you know anything about additive colors, you know that pure cyan, pure magenta, and pure yellow don't mix to black perfectly. It's kind of a muddy gray, but still you could get pretty close to it just by having those 4. And theoretically, I guess we could make a version with 5 filament feeds and put black in there as well if we wanted to do that. But for the most part, 4 would be enough to produce, if not every single color, a wide enough array of colors that we could do just about anything that we wanted with it. Forget having just 4 colors in an AMS. You could have a print that could have 6, 8, 10, 200 individual colors in a print if you wanted to, with some limitation. Once there were 3D printers in people's hands where they could try this technology out, it started to become obvious that there were some limitations and downsides to this technology. The first of which is there's no good slicer for this sort of 3D printer. There was one company that was developing a slicer that was doing absolutely amazing things until they canceled development on it. See, you can't just slice a model in Cura and then do like a color change and expect that to work. You needed to program what the colors were and how to mix them, and you needed to have that coordinated between your real life printer and the slicer. And of course, if you swap things out in a different way, it messed the whole thing up. So it was this coordinated dance that didn't have a dance partner. Now, like I said, there was one slicer that was doing amazing things, and so we had a chance to experiment with it, but there were other limitations. For instance, if you wanted to have any color coming out pure, Well, we already know that you got to purge. And even with an AMS system where the colors are just one color, one color, one color, we're not even trying to mix them, the purge is significant. And this machine didn't have a poop chute to put the purge out. None of them did at the time. They solved that problem by making an extensive shell that went around the 3D print while it was printing. That was your purge block at the time, and if you didn't make it enough, then you weren't getting enough color change when you were trying to change your color. All right, but a better slicer, we could fix that. Better purge solutions, we could fix that. There are other problems with this printer that maybe can't be fixed. For instance, okay, remember I said that you've got 4 filaments going in and getting mixed and coming out of one nozzle. Well, that's not entirely true. The filaments weren't getting mixed. They were coming out kind of like Aquafresh toothpaste. One part would come out the front and one part would come out the back. And so depending on where you were looking at the print, it would actually shift colors, favoring the cyan, magenta, white, or yellow, depending on the angle that you were looking for it. While you were printing and it was smearing the print down onto the layers, sometimes you'd get a little bit more mixing on there. But for the most part, this didn't actually mix it together that much. Well, maybe we could have a bigger mixing chamber. Of course, a bigger mixing chamber would mean that we would have to have more purge to get everything out of here, but maybe we could fix that, except for one other big problem, and this problem was possibly the final nail in the coffin of this idea. Okay, let's think about this. 4 colors going in, 1 coming out, and we want to have, say, pure magenta. What do? Well, you freeze everything except for magenta and you push magenta out while you're printing the magenta part of your print, right? Easy. Except no, because there is a problem with 3D printers called heat creep. Heat creep is where the filament itself transfers heat up itself and causes the filament to melt too high into the feed path. If it melts perhaps even as high as the feed motor, it can cause binding, jamming, and it can be really difficult to clean out. Remember I said that we had 4 colors in and 1 going out, but what is going to stop any of those inputs from being an output? These are not valved gates. They're not diodes. They could flow both directions, and if it got a little too melty, it did. Now with this printer, there was actually a solution to the heat creep problem, and that was don't let any of the filaments just sit there. As long as the filaments were pushing into the nozzle, then the only parts that got melty were the parts in the nozzle, and you were constantly feeding in new cool filament that would remain solid and keep going. Except now we can't print pure magenta. We can't print pure anything. If we wanted to print, say, white, we would print white at 97% of its speed, while cyan, magenta, and yellow all printed at 1% of their speed to ensure that they were not ever sitting there. This means that the whitest that this was capable of presenting was slightly muddy gray. The magentaist that it could present was a muddy magenta. All of the colors, all of the mixing, everything needed to have at least a little bit of each color in it, changing the color space capable in this 3D printer from bright, vibrant, solid colors to a kind of muddy, ugly color palette. Now maybe you say, oh, that's not too bad. I mean, okay, fine, we can't do bright, vibrant primary colors like we would expect on kids' toys, but I'll bet that the color palette that this thing produces would be killer on like Warhammer minis and things like that. Yeah, but coupled with the other problems in this technology, frequent jams that are extremely difficult to clean out, and the fact that nobody was developing the software for it, or those who were decided to stop because they just didn't see this as working out, Overall, this quickly became a dead-end technology, despite the fact that there were a lot of people, many of whom I know very well, who really wanted this technology to work. It just, in the end, ended up being not worth the minus sides to continue to try and develop it and refine it and fix all of the little problems that it has. I'm not really sure what to say that we learned from this experience. For those who enjoyed playing with this technology, it was certainly a lot of fun, but I don't know if a lot of the takeaway from this got adopted into 3D printing in general. Yes, it was very cool to think about the nearly unlimited color possibilities that we could put into 3D prints. Imagine being able to make a 3D print that has just as many color islands in it as you want. You were, of course, still limited to islands. You had to say, well, this part is that color, this part is that color. You couldn't do discrete color changes and put like a picture on the face of it. That's for a technology we'll talk about in another video in this series. But still, even within those islands, there were some cool things that you could do with this technology. For instance, you could say this island of color is one color at the bottom, and then by the time you get to the top, you transitioned it to another color so you could get a gradient within the solid color bodies that you're having. Honestly, this was a cool idea. There was a lot of promise in it, but in the end, its cons far outweighed the pros, and we just have to say, color mixing, you were a great idea, but it's time to let you go. So,